In our study of the life divine, we are at a fascinating chapter titled Man and the Evolution, in which Sri Aurobindo is describing the evolutionary process by which the human type has emerged out of the animal, and then extending the logic, he describes how the new supra-humanity will emerge out of the human. And in the portions we covered last time, there was one significant idea that the human being is already so designed that there is the impulse to self-exceeding. The means to make a transition consciously is already embedded within the human being, which is not so before at earlier stages of human evolution. Just this one fact ensures that the human being will work towards this self-exceeding always. Now, the extent of the self-exceeding may vary, and at different stages of human development, the ideal of what was that self-exceeding has been of various kinds. If you go back about 150 years ago, you have the ideal of a superman. Even the word superman is used, but the concept was the exaggerated, dominating, strong, vital, super intelligent, intellectual human type as a next step in human evolution. There was also another book which came around that same period, which was called The Coming New Race, or something to that effect. And it conceived of a humanity with exaggerated occult powers, that they were telepathic, they could mold matter, materialize things, pretty much doing magical things of what we today call supernatural or psychic powers. But none of them conceived of a spiritual transformation. Although in the Vedic times we have the concept of a spiritual transformation, and that concept was held by the rishis primarily still. So each step in the evolution, the human being is able to conceive only of one thing more, just a little more than what you are at. But even that is seen through the lens of what you are and is seen as an exaggeration of yourself, or removal of certain limitations of the little that you are. Sri Aurobindo is the first to give to it such a concrete and clear form, which is not even present in the Vedic vision. And that is to articulate the human next step as a spiritual change, not only in awakening to a higher spiritual consciousness, but an entire recasting of the human nature by that consciousness. And with it, a range of changes which take place in the working of the mind, in the working of the emotions, in the working of the senses, and even in the physical working. And all of these he is conceiving not merely as a rishi who sees ahead of him, but as one who embodies in himself already large parts of this vision, to the extent that almost everything he writes comes from a direct physical experience, even a direct transformation of his own consciousness, even if partially, but largely done by the time he has written about it. And this text we are reading now is about the period 1917, maybe 1918, when already within his body a large part of this work was done. And I think these last chapters perhaps they were significantly revised much later in the 30s. So everything that he says is not just speculative, but actually concretized, experiential. And where there is speculation, you will find he uses suggestive words, as we will see shortly in the passage we study today. A second important idea, which is relevant for what we are going to move into now, is that the impulse in nature aligns to the conscious individual impulse during the time of the great transitions. So, looking back at past civilizations, we have had impulses in individuals, in small collectives, occasionally in a civilization, taking it a little bit forward. But when it comes to the transition from one stage of evolution to another, a new plane of consciousness now to be manifested and realized, a new species to emerge, then that impulse is felt in nature. And all nature is as if not only turning towards this new possibility, but pushing for it actively. And it means that in every human being, that impulse is now reflected in whatever way the person is able to capture or formulate it. But the impulse actually is felt in the tissue and substance of the human species. If she is going to push the human type to move rapidly into a new type using the human as a base for the transition, then in the human body itself the impulse appears. And the human mind may or may not be conscious of it. The human mind will feel an impulse, but the body will feel a different impulse, which is subconscious to the mind proper. The result is that in the physical processes there will be changes and accelerations. I've mentioned before many times, but it's worth repeating here, that in the database of the ashram for the medical records going back since the 1950s, so almost 60 years, more than 70, almost 70 years of data, from the age 5 to age 95 or 100, of all the disciples, sadhakas working in the physical program. The database put on the computer basic physical measures show two fascinating things. First, that the average height of boys and girls is growing by the decade. So 1950s, you had the average boys being taller than girls of the same age. 1960s, both have grown. Both are taller than their previous decade. 70s another, 80s another, 90s another. And it's a steady straight line, which is amazing. And nothing significant has changed in the food. In fact, if anything, the nutritional quality of the food has dropped because of many genetically modified foods and rice which have now been introduced. But still the height is growing. And the second factor is the difference between the boys and girls average is narrowing. So it's as if the girls are growing faster, almost as if catching up. The two lines seem to project to a meeting point in another decade or two perhaps. Very interesting. And Mother spoke of how the supramental working in the physical world, in the physical matter itself, would be seen in two ways. One is, she said, change of weather patterns. That's again nature, feeling the impulse in her physical body, which is earth itself and all the earth processes in matter. And especially processes which are dynamic, which are in movement, will show result most immediately. Less dynamic processes such as minerals and their formation may also show, but it won't be as obviously apparent immediately. So in the weather patterns, Mother said it will be that all the weather patterns on Earth will change, and it will tend towards the extremes becoming less. That is, the hottest will become cooler and the coldest will become warmer. Both of which we are seeing today. And so scientists don't know whether to say it's global warming or global cooling. They just say climate change. We don't know how, but it's changing. So these two she spoke of, and the second she spoke of was the change in the human body, where she said the body form itself will change to become more close to the archetypal. That is, the distinction between the male and the female will become less and less. And she said this would be most obvious in those who work on the body consciousness, such as gymnasts and athletes. And you see this in the Olympics. When a gymnast is standing, you're not always sure if it's a man or a woman. Of course, they are often in their late teens, but still. This factor is demonstrated in the data that we have at the ashram of the average height of boys and girls tending towards alignment. But all of that is only one part. There is another thing that's happening. When nature gives this push, everything speeds up. So we see this in the new children who are born. They often struggle to cope with a mind that is prematurely developed compared to the biology. So they often demonstrate teenage thinking powers before they reach teenage, but the biology is not yet adapted. And that's part of the imbalance of this acceleration, because the mind is able to speed up in its growth much more than the body, which is more resistant. But even in the body, we see the sign that the newborn children are much more awake at the time of birth. Biologically, they show greater growth of hair and control of their fingers, even ability to open eyes and make contact, in numbers which are enormous, where earlier, going back 40 years or 50 years, hardly any would have that kind of direct ability to connect and contact in consciousness. So things which would happen as growth after birth are being pushed back before birth. Mental growth, which would happen much later in life, is happening sooner, and so on. All of this is part of the nature's impulse in the biology. And of course, in the heart and the mind, a similar push. So the mind then conceives of possibilities and tries to actualize them. Even it looks at the human body and is dissatisfied with its limitations. And there's a whole movement called transhumanism, which wants now to somehow exceed or accelerate the body capacities. And all of this, the mother looked at from a much more spiritual viewpoint around the same time that Sri Aurobindo wrote The Life Divine. She was in Japan, and there is an article which is titled To the Women of Japan. Now, the problem of the title is that it is deceptive. If you were to scroll through the contents page, you will say, To the Women of Japan, okay, I'm a man. For women, might not be interesting. Oh, it's for the Japanese women, not for me, and so on. But when you actually go through the text, she's describing something so extraordinary. She's speaking of this evolutionary transition, and I'll read from portions of it, and then I will tell you the context. Once again, nature feels one of her great impulses towards the creation of something utterly new, something unexpected. And it is to this impulse that we must answer and obey. Once again. When was the last time? Well, you have to go back a few million years. Maybe 64 million years. When the dinosaur became extinct, there was large-scale extinction, and then nature had this impulse to push forward a whole new possibility. Even the current human type is not really significantly changed in the last 500,000 years, perhaps. So you really need to go far back for this once again event. So we consider how many lifetimes you have prepared to come to this participation in the once again nature feels one of her great impulses, not the small impulses. Towards the creation of something utterly new, having no connection with anything of the past that she has created. It's not taking something and improving it. Utterly new, with elements obviously not present in anything current. Something unexpected. And the nature of this unexpected is that you cannot plan for it. All the plans you may have, all the imaginations you may put will fail you, because what will come will somehow be more than anything you could have imagined. If you recall Sri Aurobindo's text where he speaks of this passage as the hour of God, he says, at the end of it, he says, Nor let worldly prudence whisper too closely in thy ear, for it is the hour of the unexpected. So worldly prudence will fail you. So not too close, you have to keep it for practical reasons, but not much more. And then she says, let us try to discover where this impulse of nature will lead us. And the best way for that is to look back on the lesson given to us by the past. And then she looks at the transition from species to species, and each time that the best of the past is given up for the new, and so on. The conclusion, of course, for us is that the power of intelligence which we have acquired, which is the best of the human species, is what in fact will be lost in the emergence of a higher grade of consciousness, and particularly of intuition. So I'm skipping to that now. I would highly recommend for you to read the whole text on your own. The new race shall be governed by intuition. That is to say, direct perception of the divine law within. Beautiful definition of intuition. There is the divine law, truth within you. It's there, I don't know it. If at all my perception of it is there, it is indirect. I feel this tendency across the years. I've always felt the need to do this or that, and so that must be my temperament, my innate truth, and so on. But here you see directly, you know directly. Some human beings actually know and experience intuition, as undoubtedly certain big gorillas of the forest have glimpses of reasoning. So the best of human intuition she's dismissing as gorillas with glimpses of reason, because the true intuition will be much more. Our intuition is fickle. Once in a while it flashes, and what little flashes is mixed and diluted, and you cannot access it directly. Even if you could access directly, how much of it can you gain? When the full power of intuition is lived in, you are living in it. It's what drives you. It is what acts at every moment. And so it's something far greater than anything we've experienced, which are only glimpses of intuition. And then she says, in mankind, the very few who have cultivated their inner self, who have concentrated their energies in the discovery of the true law of their being, possess more or less the faculty of intuition. And she says how you have to make the mind silent and so on to receive that. I'm skipping that. The faculty which is exceptional, almost abnormal now, will certainly be quite common and natural to the new race, the man of tomorrow. But probably the constant exercise of it will be detrimental to the reasoning faculties. As man possesses no more the extreme physical ability of the monkey, so also will the Superman lose the extreme mental ability of man. And what is that extreme mental ability? She says, the ability to deceive himself and others. It's interesting, when I visited once in Bombay a school for, the politically correct word is mentally challenged. Earlier you would say retarded children. And a school for that. And the principal of the school was saying, they are so loving, so spontaneous, so true to themselves. They don't know how to lie. Very interesting. And even if they've done something wrong, they just say, oh, I did this, and that's all. And the ability to lie is in fact one of the faculties that develops with reason. And the epitome of reason is the ability to lie to yourself to such a degree that you believe whatever you want. And all of that, of course, goes away. Thus, man's road to supermanhood will be open when he declares boldly that all he has yet developed, including the intellect of which he is so rightly and yet so vainly proud, is now no longer sufficient for him. Now, this is the point important for us. We need to declare this to ourselves. All that you have developed, including the intellect, is no longer sufficient for him, and that to uncase, discover, set free this greater power within shall be henceforward his great preoccupation. And this has to be our focus, our constant priority. Then will his philosophy, art, science, ethics, social existence, vital pursuits be no longer an exercise of mind and life for themselves in a circle, but a means for the discovery of a greater truth behind mind and life, and the bringing of its powers into our human existence. So it doesn't mean you give up all this. Everything you're currently doing is now used for accessing something higher and bringing it now into the human existence. And this discovery is that of our real because our highest self and nature. And then she speaks of what it should not be, not the Nietzsche Superman, etc. Therefore, the individuals who will most help the future of humanity in the new age will be those who will recognize a spiritual evolution as the destiny and therefore the great need of the human being. An evolution or conversion of the present type of humanity into a spiritualized humanity, even as the animal man has been largely converted into a highly mentalized humanity. So the spiritualized humanity is the immediate next step. We're not even speaking of the supramental. And then she speaks of the changes in beliefs, religions, and so on, all of which will become secondary. Even morality and ethics will become secondary. The key point, she says, is the transcendence of the ego and the emergence of the psychic principle as the leading power in humanity. She also speaks, you see, there were 2 drafts to this text, some of which she revised, and she says in one of them that this great civilization which is now coming to a crashing end was formed by the intelligence, by the intellect. And she's saying this 100 years ago, remember. Great civilization coming to a crashing end. The actual form of its crashing end we're seeing today. But, that whole vision is of nature's large impulse. Also the time frame is somewhat large for it. Now, the context I said I would share with you last. And it was in the context where she's speaking to the women of Japan, and she points out that in Japan particularly, so much importance is given to the children because they're hope for the new age, for the new future. And it is in this context that she says that, dramatically, the Superman shall be born of woman. This is a big, unquestionable truth. And so she focuses on the women, because if they can prepare themselves to give birth to something of a higher consciousness, bring into that whole process a higher consciousness and possibility, conceive of the highest and give form to that. Thus we see that at this critical period of the world's life, it is no longer sufficient to give birth to a being in whom our highest personal ideal is manifested. We must strive to find out what is the future type, not our highest conception. What Advent nature is planning. It is no longer sufficient to form a man similar to the greatest men we have heard of or known, or even greater, more accomplished and gifted than they. We must strive to come in touch mentally by the constant aspiration of our thought and will with the supreme possibility which, exceeding all human measures and features, will give birth to the Superman. And then she says, once again nature feels one of her great impulses. And therefore she says, and it is to this impulse that we must answer and obey. Now, the reason why I put this part last, if you read it only in the context of giving birth, we must answer and obey to this impulse of nature, then the whole thing acquires a very different meaning. Oh, just to give birth, we must answer to nature's impulse to give birth to this new type. No, she's speaking of something much bigger. And she used the context of birth because she was talking to women in Japan in a context when that was something so important. While that is still valid, what she's speaking of is much more in alignment to the great impulse of nature. And so we set that aside now and we look at the text where we were at. Where Sri Aurobindo says now, the fact that in nature there is this stress of spirituality in the race, which is increasing, that, he says, we can take as a sign that it is nature's intention. So, If it be supposed that her next step, nature's next step, is the spiritual and supramental being, the stress of spirituality in the race may be taken as a sign that that is nature's intention, the sign too of the capacity of man to operate in himself or aid her to operate the transition. And so here comes this alignment. What we do and what nature is doing has to work in collaboration. Now, this collaboration will have a psycho-spiritual internal component. That's the yoga that you do. But it will also have an external component where the human consciousness, aligning to nature's inspiration, will use the technological means given to us by nature to develop and assist in this transformation. You note Sri Aurobindo uses her next step is the spiritual and supramental being, suggestive that the supramental is the culmination, but in between there is a spiritualization and perhaps even series of spiritual steps. The vocabulary is not important, it is the concept which is important. And what would be the distinction between the two? The supramental being is one in whom even the physical material is supramentalized. And obviously that would not be from the birth from an existing human body, because the existing human body can only give birth to physical tissue made of itself. So physical tissue made of itself, containing a consciousness which is higher, or which is open and responsive to a higher consciousness, would be the spiritualized humanity. Within that, a physical tissue might undergo further refinement and give birth now to something still more refined and so on each time, but it will still be a spiritual humanity going through finer gradations, preparing for the decisive change of a supramental being. And so Sri Aurobindo refers to this new appearance, new type, as the appearance in the human being of a spiritual type resembling mental animal humanity, but already with the stamp of the spiritual aspiration on it, would be the obvious method of nature for the evolutionary production of the spiritual and supramental being. And that's why today, looking back at the text of the mother's speech to the women of Japan, if humanity can participate not only in the reproduction in the new children of a higher consciousness or imprint, but in the spiritual invocation of a higher consciousness in them, but also at the same time in ourselves and in the way we educate the children. The same principle would apply in everything we do. The fact that we put ourselves in that activity, in that effort, is already initiating this transition. Now, what will be the nature of that transition? And Sri Aurobindo now gives you 3 sentences. The first one he offers as a suggestion. The second one he presents as a logical step. And the third one he offers as a concession. We'll see very interesting ideas he puts forward, but he only states them. First, he says, it is pertinently suggested that if such an evolutionary culmination is intended and man is to be its medium, it will only be a few especially evolved human beings who will form the new type and move towards the new life. This is a suggestion. And he uses the word pertinent, which literally means, if you go back to the root, stretching out. So if you stretch the logic of it without building too much, almost obviously, suggestion though. Maybe it's not exactly how nature will do it, but it seems the most obvious way. That if the human being is going to be the medium of this, then a few will form the new type and move towards this new life. Not all. Although the impulse may be felt in all, the responsiveness of all is different. In some, a greater responsiveness, in others, a less capacity to respond. So while nature is pushing, everybody grows, but from where you are and where you are and your readiness is developed, some may grow much more. And it is these to which he is pointing. a few especially evolved human beings who will form the new type. Not more evolved, especially evolved. So even in your evolution, you must be especial in order to be able to be part of that. That, once done, the rest of humanity will sink back from a spiritual aspiration, no longer necessary for nature's purpose, and remain quiescent in its normal status. And this is the part fascinating. It's still part of the first sentence. Once this transition is made by a few, the mass of humanity will fall back. That urge of spiritual aspiration will fall back because nature will stop pushing. She has finished her work. The new species is offered now, is created, drawn out from the human type, pushed forward, separate, able to sustain itself. And humanity will sink back. The rest of humanity will sink back. Not a very nice thing to think about. But when you look at the apes today in the forests, this is what happened there. There's a whole text of the mother in the agenda where she describes this is what happened. Among the apes, a few were pushed forward and yearned for and made the transition to the human type, and then the rest sank back to become the normal apes again. The urge to the human mind state, no more so vivid. Still it's there because the imprint of that push is never lost. So in the ape type, there's always this curiosity. Oh, what's this human being? What's this power of thought? And a kind of aspiration, but that's about it. Not that intense urge. And so something similar, the rest of humanity will sink back from a spiritual aspiration no longer necessary for nature's purpose. So as long as your aspiration was a product of nature's push, you will lose it when nature stops pushing. But if your aspiration was directly your conscious soul's aspiration aligned to nature, then of course that will continue. How many in humanity? As a quick percentage, you go to any country and look for how many have a spiritual aspiration, conscious and active. Even the yearning for yoga today is more for health reasons than spiritual reasons. And if at all there's a spiritual interest, it's more an interest or a curiosity. So the few who have this urge, maybe percentage-wise, they're 1%. And you're lucky if it's 1%. But that gives you a sense of what happens in the transition. That 1% will perhaps break through and the rest sink back. And after the sinking back, remain quiescent in its normal status. What is mind's normal status? All you need to do is look back what it was like 200 years ago. Everywhere in the world. Mind's normal status before this urge or ideal of some new supermanhood emerged suddenly everywhere. And that's normal humanity. Not very pretty. So this was the first sentence where Sri Aurobindo offers as a pertinent suggestion. But you can stretch it out. The logic is obvious. The second suggestion he gives, the second sentence, is now reasoned out. It can equally be reasoned. So the first pertinent suggestion has a logical continuity, but the second one has a logical character that the human gradation must be preserved if there is really an ascent of the soul by reincarnation through the evolutionary degrees towards the spiritual summit. Remember the earlier discussion many pages back where this idea was there that actually evolution is more through reincarnation than a species change. So each type is flexible within a narrow band, overlapping in flexibility with the next type, whose lowest is crossed by the highest of the lower type. So there's an overlap in consciousness. So the soul then moves from one type into the next, extends as far as it can in its growth of consciousness, jumps to the next type, and so on. So there's a kind of a ladder of evolution across the types. The dog, especially domesticated dog, is actually capable of becoming very close to the human consciousness, except he can't speak. But in intelligence, equally complex and rich. In emotion, even more developed than many humans. And when it has crossed that point, which is higher than the lowest of humanity, in the next birth, the dog will take birth into this human and continue exactly where he left off in consciousness. He is not a dog. He is this evolving soul who was housed in a dog and housed in a human. But it's the evolving soul that matters. So with this, logically, the human gradation must be preserved. So there'll always be the human type, it'll never be totally replaced. For otherwise, the most necessary of all the intermediate steps will be lacking. Now you look back at evolution. For the many types of animals that you have, for different grades of consciousness and powers of consciousness, often there are many for a given grade. If you have the dog, sometimes horses also can be equally complex, apes also can be equally complex, dolphins are more complex even in intelligence and social behavior. So there are multiple possibilities. You could move from dolphin to human, from dog to human, even from horse or ape to human, and so on. But from human to suprahuman, how many are there? It's only one, the human type. And so he says, the most necessary of all intermediate steps. But also especially because the human type is the only one which has built in the impulse for exceeding itself. That capacity will remain, obviously. So the third sentence, now he offers as a concession. And it's as if you cannot anymore argue logically for this third thing, and so you have to accept that this is so. It must be conceded at once that there is not the least probability or possibility of the whole human race rising in a block to the supramental level. Now there are people who have actually spoken like that. Having read Sri Aurobindo, they have misunderstood Sri Aurobindo's conception of the evolution by saying all of humanity will suddenly rise in a block into the supramental. What is suggested is nothing so revolutionary and astonishing, but only the capacity in the human mentality, when it has reached a certain level or a certain point of stress of the evolutionary impetus, to press towards a higher plane of consciousness and its embodiment in the being. Now, what has Sri Aurobindo suggested? And he is making sure we have not misunderstood. He has suggested that the capacity in the human mentality, when it has grown to a certain level, and there are many levels it has to pass through, and at that point, if it receives the stress of evolutionary impetus, then the capacity exists to press towards a higher plane of consciousness and its embodiment in the being. This is where we are at. As disciples of Sri Aurobindo who have this urge to participate in the evolution, this is where we are at. There is the capacity by which we can access a higher state of consciousness and embody it. And that's all. It doesn't mean everybody moves into the supramental step in one go. Now it happened in 1992, there was a conference in the Pondicherry University on Sri Aurobindo, and the theme was Sri Aurobindo, Bridge Between the Past and the Future. Many people were called, and there was one professor there who put forward this argument that Sri Aurobindo says that even if one person is supramentalized, all of humanity will suddenly be supramentalized. So, since we don't see much sign of it happening, we have to wait for that one person to do it. And he declared this as if it's fact. And he's a professor teaching in Calcutta in a big university, professor with a big name. So my teacher, MP Pandit, took the mic after that and he said, this is a very strange idea. I have only encountered it earlier before in the writings of Osho, Rajneesh. Where Rajneesh, at that time he was known as Rajneesh, in his books says, be very careful about Sri Aurobindo. Don't read him. Why? If you read him, he can convince you of anything because he's so logical. But then his point of defeating Sri Aurobindo logically was, he says, all he may convince you of anything, but the weak point of his whole logic is, he says that if one person becomes supramental, everybody will become supramental. How is this? This is ridiculous, this is illogical. And therefore he dismisses Sri Aurobindo. And Panditji quotes him and says, this is the only writer I saw who has this kind of strange statement. So where did you get this? And Sri Aurobindo asked the professor, Panditji asked the professor, where did you get this idea? Because I have not heard it anywhere else. And the professor took the mic and said sheepishly, I was Rajneesh's professor. I taught him that. Very strange. So one man who misread, misunderstood. Perhaps, Sri Aurobindo has this statement, one man's perfection can yet save the world. Something like that. But that's not the supramentalization or evolutionary step. So maybe he mixed things, he misunderstood, and Sri Aurobindo has explicitly made sure that we do not have such a misunderstanding. And if you now accept this, look at Rajneesh's logic for dismissing Sri Aurobindo, and we have to dismiss that because it was falsely stated to him. And then Rajneesh says, be careful of Sri Aurobindo, he can convince you of everything. Well, he convinces you of what is true only because he stays with the logic. And very clearly Sri Aurobindo says, there is not the least probability or possibility of the whole human race rising in a block to the supramental level. Only this, in a few, the capacity to experience this higher plane of consciousness and embody it under the stress of that evolutionary impulse. And that's all. But when that happens, when this transition begins to take place in consciousness terms, when by the stress of evolutionary impulse we embody a higher grade of consciousness, when even perhaps a next step begins to emerge of a spiritualized humanity, which he has spoken of here, endowed, a spiritual impulse endowed with a spiritual type resembling mental animal humanity, what happens? The being will necessarily undergo by this embodiment a change from the normal constitution of its nature. Now remember, this is part of our work ongoing as we are today, an attempt to open to a higher consciousness and embody it. And so all the rest applies to us equally, however minutely. But increasingly as we open to the higher consciousness and it works in us directly, this will become more and more obvious. Necessarily some change will happen in the embodiment from the normal constitution of its nature. And what's the change? A change certainly of its mental and emotional and sensational constitution, and also to a great extent of the body consciousness and the physical conditioning of our life and energies. All 5 gradations undergo a change. But what is the character of the change? But the change of consciousness will be the chief factor. The initial movement, the physical modification will be a subordinate factor, a consequence. So first, change of consciousness. Your consciousness becomes so different, you can look back at what you were 10 or 20 years ago and say, I'm not that person. I don't even remember what it's like to be that person. I think so differently. I feel so differently. My relationship with the world, with people, with things is so different. I look back and I say, my God, what was that person? It's almost like a different life. That's the change in consciousness. As a result, as a subordinate factor, even physical modifications will take place. Now for this, it's always good to look at the more extreme examples. We look at the mother or Sri Aurobindo's body, and we see things there which are quite unusual. But it's not because they did things to the body by genetic intervention or by food change. In fact, they did no such thing at all. They didn't even bother with food changes except what was minimum of what was available as option. And yet, their body had something quite extraordinary. So one example, which was narrated by the young boy who was involved in recording mother's talks in the playground, who then became the chief engineer in the ashram. And in his interview when he was in the 80s, he said something extraordinary which he always found admirable. Mother would be sitting at her chair, meeting people one after another, not even a sip of water in between, no discomfort of any kind, for up to 3 hours at a time. At least 2 hours, up to 3 hours at a time, sometimes more. At no point is her body restless. Now look what happens to us if we are seated for half an hour or more. After a while, some adjustment, blood flow, something blocking, some discomfort, some stretch, nothing at all. 2 hours, 3 hours. And after 3 hours, She will look like that. Nobody else left. All finished. And then pluck, she gets up. No leaning back. Oh, no stretching, no tiredness, no discomfort. Not even using the support of the armrest, obviously. She just gets up straight, stands, and walks straight out. And what does it mean? What does it mean for you to be able to do that? It means your body is so conscious and so flexible that there is no inertia, no dullness, no heaviness that is obstructing anything. The body is fully conscious. It can stay in sustained activity for so many hours, no restlessness, no disturbance. And she gets up and walks. And the muscles and everything are conscious, clear, fresh, sattvic, if nothing else. No tamas, no restlessness of rajas. At the very least. Maybe there's much more to it, but at the very least, this would be what we can see. And of course, there is more to it because she has been working in her physical cellular consciousness to bring down something of the supramental into it. So there's much more happening to it. But this is so obvious. And then there are a few other unusual examples where we see the flexibility, where her face form changes, and I've shared experiences of that, where even from morning to evening there is a difference in form. And Sri Aurobindo's comment when someone asks about it, he says that mother's body is flexible enough that at every moment it represents, the form changes to represent the consciousness that she is embodying. So this would be an obvious physical outcome of a change of consciousness. Now, if you scale back from this, you can see so many other things would be part of it. One of them would be your body's ability to process food, to be able to manage food in different ways. With less food, extract more energy. And you will see this in the younger ages, the body is able to extract much more from a given food. In older ages, ability to extract becomes less efficient and so on. The body's ability to regenerate. The senses of the body becoming more amplified, more sensitive and so on. All of those would be part of changes as a result of consciousness change. But let's look at the whole thing in sequence first. First he says, the change in the normal constitution of nature, all three bodies of us. First he says, change certainly of its mental. In the mind, which is the most flexible, most receptive, the most open and wide part of our vehicle of body, embodiment. In fact, the mind is much larger than the brain and the body size. It can open and be trained to open to so much more. And so that's the obvious part where all the changes take place. In my own experience, to share an example, I was struggling with a certain experience of, let's say, the thinking part of the mind, and I could not remember what it's like. And then one day, as I was waking up from sleep, I was in a phase, in a state of consciousness. I said, yes, this is what it was 20 years ago. And then when I woke up fully, again it shifted substantially, and I said, now I remember. But the normal functioning and the functioning 20 years ago, there's a huge change. What the nature of the change is not important, because in each one of us, we have moved from what we were 20 years ago to what we are now. And if you look back and see, it's difficult to recall what it was like. It seems so petty, so small, so narrow to be in that mind mold. And this can go even faster. Mother spoke of, she made this comment, she said, don't hold me back for what I've said earlier, because within a few moments, I have moved many kilometers ahead in consciousness. So wherever we are, 20 years is a long enough time to have a radical change. But at some point, maybe every year, we will have a radical change. Every month, every day perhaps. And it should become increasingly more rapid. Second, he speaks of change, emotional constitution. So mental constitution, the way the mind is constituted, the way it's built up, the way it works is now fundamentally changed. Obviously increasing towards intuitivization. And all the functions, even your memory, your logic, etc., will become more intuitivized. But the same thing happening with the emotional. Your emotional constitution changing, what would it mean? Increasingly aligned to the psychic center. increasingly expressive of the colors of the psychic consciousness. No more hard, rigid moods, swinging, switching, covering, rather colors, glows of vibrations of the psychic presence taking on different forms in the emotions. Obviously, therefore, less personal, more free, less narrow in individuality, more embracing, more universal, and less deceptive and pretentious, more true and spontaneous. But in their working, when the emotions change, it's as if you flow from one state to another, but in a continuum, not switching states, not abruptly. Momentarily I was happy, now suddenly I'm unhappy because you told me something which was bad news. And clap, there's a switch, now I've forgotten what it's like to be happy. That's not normal. That's pieces, fragmented emotional being. In the normal emotional flow, it will go like this and switch, and it'll never lose the continuity because the center of it will be one from where you live, the psychic being. I remember a description again which comes to mind, which is so typical of the mother. She never lost her cool. If at all she had to say something which was harsh, it was a very conscious application of force, but never from an anger or a loss of control. So I remember an incident where mother's driver, Bala, narrated to us how she had hired him. He was the son of the maidservant who was cleaning Sri Aurobindo's room. So mother took him on as her own child, as one of the ashramites, and he was the driver for her. And one day he told us in the interview, he said, I don't know what happened to me, something went really bad, and then I started abusing the mother in front of everybody. The whole ashram community is standing there. Mother is about to enter the car and he says, man, in French. So he says, Mère, you are like this, you are like that. And finally he uses this phrase, Mère, vous êtes pire que les créoles. You're worse than these, the lowest type of... And mother is standing there. He said she just stood there quietly listening to everything he said. And when he had finished, she said to him very quietly, there's a little bug that has got into your head. All right, you want to go, you leave. But when you're free from that bug, you can come back. And then she gets on into her car and goes on with her thing. He left, and then afterwards he got free of it, came back. She again gave him back his work. But that calm clarity and the ability to handle the situation from the most negative, from the most positive to the most negative. Another incident where working for Auroville, one of the persons working to bring money for the project, they had prepared the report signed by the mother, which was sent, I believe it was to the Ford Foundation. They were going to fund everything. All problems would have been taken care of financially. And somebody else within the institution created an independent parallel report signed by him and sent. And the foundation, receiving 2 reports, said, we're not interested in the politics. They cut off. And the man who brought the news to the mother, saying that they have withdrawn, he was weeping. He went to the mother and said, Mother, it's gone. And mother is pacifying him. Don't worry, my child. It's my problem, not your problem. You should not cry. But that calm, where an entire project she's pushing at the age of 90, 91, 92, and everything goes wrong, literally, overnight, because of one person's stupidity. And no anger, no disturbance. She said, it's my project, it's my problem. And she has to console everybody and push on. That kind of freedom of the emotions, and yet the full free play of the true emotions of the psychic being, that would be the constitutional change. It now works by a different substance even. And then the sensational constitution. All your senses now operate, not just by registering mechanically. Sri Aurobindo explains how the work of the senses is to faithfully transfer what comes to them without bias, without distortion, and feed them up to the mind. And the life energies give to them certain values, and then the mind further gives them, and so something gets clouded in the way. But the free working of the senses will mean everything comes in at the same time with equal importance, and nothing is missed, no detail lost, every nuance caught. Now, this is not our case. We're constantly limited and biased. Mother was even so conscious that things happening behind her she would sense, and occasionally people were talking behind her or doing some mischievous things, and afterwards, just so that they know, she would say to them, I have eyes behind my head. So she knew, and so on. There's an example again of someone narrating how he went to the mother. There was a long queue of more than 100, 200 people in the playground. She was giving groundnut to each one. So this young boy has taken groundnuts, he's gone, finished it, he's hungry, he comes back, joins the queue and comes again. And mother gives him as normal. He goes away, he thinks, mother didn't notice. Next day when he comes for the peanuts, mother takes 2 scoops in the very first go. She's noticed everything. And it was the experience of people working with her. Nothing missed her eye, nothing missed her perceptions or her senses. She would hear things at a distance even. I remember a story I had heard when I was still small, because the circus was a big thing at that time, because you didn't have, cinema and stuff. It was one of those few examples where you could go and see real animals, lions or elephants, whatever. And we were told at that time that mother didn't like people going to the circus. And one of the stories I had heard was she heard the lion unhappy. And the circus was in town, and she says, no, that's not nice. They should not be caged up like that. But that in her hearing, in her senses, she had this wide perception. And it's not just an occult development, it's the natural working of the liberated senses. And all of this would be naturally part of this consciousness. The question is only of degrees. So sensational constitution, the senses themselves now work differently. And then also to a great extent, body consciousness and physical conditioning of our life and energies. So body consciousness, when the body is conscious and more awake, it begins to tell you, especially when it is more intuitivized, it tells you what it needs, it tells you what it wants. It can even give you precise knowledge. So I had one experience, which I don't know if it has recurred later. It was in the 1990s. I had a computer, desktop, personal computer, and I was working with it. And I knew there was a special command. In those days, even the mouse was not so important. Everything was done through keystrokes, and you had to remember commands. I knew there was a special way to mark out a vertical block of text and extract it. And there was a special command. It was not there in the help menu. I had read of it somewhere in an article a year or two before. It was not in the help menu. There was no way to find it. And I tried every combination I could think of. I couldn't get it. And I said, okay, forgotten, doesn't matter. Now I have to work on it the hard way. And my mind is like that, looking away. My fingers are on the keyboard. And suddenly the hand moves and it goes click, 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 click. What did I do? The command had been executed. And my mind is looking back, what did I do? And I don't even know. I cannot recall because the hands did it automatically. And I cannot recall. And what was it? And almost as if I tried to feel the space they worked in and reconstruct it from the feeling of the movement of the fingers, which key strokes it must have been. 4 strokes, one after another. It cannot happen by chance. It was a memory or an intelligence in the body which I had retained because I had used it once a couple of years ago, and somehow it acted on. It was in a period when I was with my teacher he was doing something quite extraordinary, and I was having many different experiences, all of which passed later because he was doing it, not so much me. But at that time I experienced things in the body in this way which were unusual. But this can become the normal state for the physical consciousness, that once it has experienced something, it can hold it as a knowledge, vividly kept to be drawn out as necessary in the body consciousness. It is this knowledge of body which you see in an expert gymnast. I've seen, for example, in school when we were training for doing cartwheels and things like that, some people would just do it. You do a somersault, some people just got it. And then there were the rest of us who were kludgy and we couldn't do it so easily. And now that I look back, I can see it's almost as if in the body instinct they knew. ended it. Looking at someone, they could absorb in the body and it woke up. So the body instinct is actually capable of receiving knowledge as an experience in the body. Mother commented, the body has not learned something unless it has experienced it. And so she gave great importance to the body consciousness awakening by experiential content in the body state. And it holds it as a state of body consciousness. There's something else which I want to, maybe it's a digression, but it's an expansion of this idea. In one of the passages in the mother's agenda, she had this unusual experience in the body, and then she came to the conclusion from it. She said, I experienced in my body not one state but multiple states at the same time. And then she said, if this is what the body is meant to be able to hold in the future evolution, then she said, it is the most extraordinary instrument ever developed in evolution by nature. Now, the full import of this is difficult to appreciate until one experiences that. But remember, I said the body experiences things by holding it as a state. I am this. It holds multiple states, which means it can do multiple things. It can be multiple things at the same time in the physical instrument. The vital being cannot, the mental being cannot. For example, in the mind, you can't hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. Well, you can, but it's split. You can't hold two emotions at the same time. Again, you can, but it's split. One part is unhappy, one part is happy. But there are different levels within the emotional being, or different parts. But in the body, in one single instrument, to hold multiple states, multiple experiences, is something extraordinary. And these are all part of the body consciousness awakening as it so develops into the new states or new steps of evolution of the spiritual consciousness. But also in the physical conditioning, even the biological processes would undergo change. One obvious effect is the body appears to be younger, or is more plastic, more conscious as a result of the change of consciousness. And with it, obviously, many conditionings will change, but that's not it. It would push a step further that it could dynamically intensify certain capacities or hold them back, which are proper to the biological functioning. So you could, for example, consciously intensify the digestive process, consciously shift the rhythms of the body. The problem of jet lag, you could shift by will and re-synchronize the body clock and so on. In Sri Aurobindo's body, the body had become so conscious, he said that he could drink poison and it would simply pass through the digestive process. The body would simply avoid taking it in. It would pass through without doing any harm to the body. And that means the whole digestive tract and its working was part of the conscious portion and no more subconscious. Even constitutionally, other changes would mean certain biological processes would change. And this has extraordinary implications. Again, the evidence for it exists. When, for example, the body uses up the immediate sugar and you're running, it doesn't have any more sugar to burn as heat for calories. It now takes fat and starts breaking it down to extract sugar from it. But it doesn't do it normally. It does it when it needs to, when its stores are finished. So there are two modes in which it can operate to extract energy. Is there a third mode? Is there a fourth mode? Can it in fact invent a new mode of extraction of energy or changing any of its processes, synthesizing material as necessary? And that would be one of the implications of the change in the constitution even of the body itself. So there are many implications of this. Sri Aurobindo just leaves it as a suggestion by saying constitutional change, and that's about all. But in all this, the transmutation of the consciousness will always remain possible to the human being when the flame of the soul, the psychic kindling, becomes potent in heart. Remember, he said change of consciousness will be first factor, the initial movement, physical modification, subordinate factor, consequence. Now, in the changes, transmutation of consciousness will always remain possible to the human being when the soul, the psychic kindling, becomes potent in heart and mind and the nature is ready. So, whatever else may change, in the human being and even in the suprahuman, this factor is common. Change of consciousness because of the flame of aspiration within. But in the suprahuman, this will take on a special form, transmutation of consciousness. Not change of consciousness, not growth of consciousness, not awakening, but transmutation. It means the substance becomes something else altogether. Iron becomes gold. This symbol of transmutation is being used extensively in old cultures who glimpsed this possibility and tried to realize it within their limited capacities. So in some of the cultures, particularly in the West, you will see the form it took was in what was called alchemy, where they used a double language which used physical symbols but at the same time described psycho-spiritual transformations or transmutations. Iron is our unconscious physical substance, gold is the divinized substance, or iron is the mind, which is as it is normal, gold is the divinized mind. But at the same time, the processes had their replication physical substance. So iron literally could be made to undergo a change into gold by following a certain series of steps, which steps corresponded to steps in the psycho-spiritual transformation, also transmutation to get to something else. So it was as if a double language. Those who were more materially oriented practiced the material transmutation, the spiritual had the spiritual transmutation. But the key was this: you could not do the material transmutation unless you had a change of consciousness or some access to the spiritual transmutation. That's why the formulas don't work. If you just take the formula and apply it, it doesn't work. There is a human factor involved, a human consciousness engaging with the material. Literally, the consciousness of the iron as it is processed. In India, it is called a Rasayana Shastra, from which they derive also much of modern chemistry. But in the Rasayana Shastra, they speak of 16 stages of transmutation. So in the first stage, it is purification and multiple kinds of purification. And they involve physical purification, vital purification, mental purification, and their equivalent physical processes. And then stages of transmutation and so on. But what is interesting is, as you go up the ladder of the process, it becomes less and less chemistry, more and more, if you had to invent a word, suprachemistry or psychochemistry, where the person doing the activity, his consciousness is being infused in the process itself, in the chemical process. Now there is enough evidence in modern chemistry and biology to demonstrate that this actually plays a huge role. There are many chemical experiments which in their early stages were extremely unstable and difficult to replicate. A scientist worked upon it until he perfected the technique, and now it became easy to replicate. And suddenly all the laboratories in the world can do it easily. And so the idea is as if the human consciousness has engaged with the physical process at a molecular level, even with the intention sustained to give into nature or form into nature a new habit groove. Once it has formed everywhere in all labs, it becomes easy, and now you can even play with the boundaries and still get easy results, when earlier it was almost impossible except in a very narrow boundary. The same happens with plants. You struggle to create a special breed of flower color or type, and it's very precarious and balanced, but once you have got it and it's become stable as a habit in nature, you find everywhere else people are able to breed it quickly. And so there is a clear engagement from human consciousness to physical processes and biological processes. And especially when in the laboratory cellular cultures, the relationship you set with the cells can make a huge difference. often in cellular experiments, they have the same experiment done on 500 cells, of which 400 will simply fail and die out, and out of the 100, maybe 10 or 5 will have the particular result you want. But when certain people do the experiments, the numbers are enormously higher. When other people do it, the numbers of success are enormously lower. Why? Because you are in interaction with it. So I'm digressing, but this is to show you how in alchemy there is this factor which is extremely important, and the psycho-spiritual and the physical are connected. But this transmutation idea was there for a long time, but it was seen in limited terms. Sri Aurobindo is giving this word here. He does not use this often. He's using this word now in a very special way. The transmutation of the consciousness will always remain possible to the human being. But the condition for it, he says, when the flame of the soul, the psychic kindling, becomes potent in heart and mind, and the nature is ready. So two things are required. Your nature should be ready, and second, the psychic flame within must become powerful. Potent means power to act, to influence in heart and mind. Interesting sequence. First suggestion is it emerges and has a stronger influence in the heart than in the mind. And of course, it will change according to human types. But the reason for this, he explains, is that the psychic center is just behind the emotions. And so its first influence is obviously on the emotions. And then through the emotions, it influences the mind. So you start feeling suddenly uncomfortable about something that you have been doing. And then the mind says, why am I feeling uncomfortable? And then it gives to it a logical explanation. But the mind's thinking does not immediately change. It's the discomfort felt in the heart, which is your starting point. Later, as the mind is more psychicized, it thinks in certain ways. It cannot accept to think in other ways, which are false, obviously, which are untrue, which are unacceptable. And that's when the mind has been changed. So the starting point is the strong influence in the heart and then in the mind, and the readiness of the nature, obviously, to receive this influence and its action. And with this, the transmutation of the consciousness will always remain possible to the human being. Now, why is he saying this? Because after the new step takes place, remember he said the human consciousness will subside. What happens when you're living as a normal human mind? Well, it's not very interesting anymore. But still inside that, this factor will be there always. The possibility to transmute your consciousness through this double process of psychic kindling in heart and mind and readiness of nature. The readiness of nature is more difficult. That's why he puts it later. In the evolution of humanity now subsiding from the urge of nature having ended, you'll find many finer gradations. So humanity will start from a barbaric humanity to a mentalized humanity and maybe to a refined mentalized humanity where you can say nature is ready. You can have a strong psychic urge and influence, but the nature substance may be still very crude and coarse. The biology is still inherited from the barbaric, and you have still to go through a refinement process. So you're fortunate if your biology is sattvic, then the whole spiritual journey becomes much more easy. If your biology has strong rajasic pulls and pushes, you're always struggling with back and forth. And such people rarely have a smooth spiritual passage, but they do have a very strong physical and vital effectivity with whatever little spiritual access they have. So such people often go more into the occult realm than in the pure spiritual journey. The sattvic type is more naturally oriented to the pure spiritual rather than the occult, where he doesn't have the vitality or the strength of vital to hold and manage the occult demands of the occult energies. So clear requirement, psychic awakening and readiness of your physical nature and mental and vital nature having been sufficiently refined. But still the possibility remains always in the human being, even after the new step of evolution. And why, he says, the spiritual aspiration is innate in man. For he is, unlike the animal, aware of imperfection and limitation, and feels that there is something to be attained beyond what he now is. Animal does not know what he cannot do. In fact, the advantage of the animal life is they're happy with what they are. The disadvantage of the human type is we know what we cannot do, and so we are always unhappy. Even though we can do great things, we are always unhappy with what great things may seem great to others, but whatever we have achieved is always insufficient. Feels that something more. This urge towards self-exceeding is not likely ever to die out totally in the race. Now, this phrasing is very suggestive and even a little disturbing. On the one hand, he's saying the urge of self-exceeding will not die out. But see the wording he uses. And Sri Aurobindo is very precise with his wording. He says that it will always be there. He says, this urge towards self-exceeding is not likely ever to die out totally in the race. Meaning it is likely to die out, but not totally. Meaning it will subside enormously. And he says it's not likely, meaning there's doubt. It might still die out, at least in large parts of the race. So the suggestion is, and that's why I said look back at humanity 200 years ago or 500 years ago. And do you see obviously in parts of humanity this urge, except for a few patches, except for occasional ages where it burst out, took a strong religious turn, but that's gone now. That's why I said 200 years is the time when the skepticism of the reasoning mind has come in. It has thrown out the religious urge. And then what do you see in the rational mind of humanity? And it's something very crude. Sri Aurobindo describes it as a barbarism of the civilized man, who is barbaric, literally. You have forms of culturing, refinement, but the crude impulses within you are still selfish, self-centered and barbaric. So the suggestion here is, on the one hand, he's saying it will never die out totally, but it will subside so much that you might find it difficult even to see it. The human mental status will be always there, but it will be there not only as a degree in the scale of rebirth, but as an open step towards the spiritual and supramental status. So what will be subsequent to this transition, the status of the human being? Well, of course, in the scale, we can see it has to be there as a band of consciousness of mind. Not only that, but the character of that is that it opens to something higher. And so every human life will go through finer gradations until it is ready for a new embodiment in the new species, and then it will make the transition. But this openness towards the spiritual and supramental status will be there. Unlike earlier stages, where you do not have obviously an openness to the next stage. And with this, he completes the passage involving this transition to new consciousness. Now, Sri Aurobindo turns to the importance of this current transition of humanity and compares it later to what was lacking in previous stages, what makes this transition important, distinctive, and we will see there the power of consciousness, self-awareness, ability to participate in the transition and so on, all of which really point to the capacity for yoga. Yoga as conscious, accelerated evolution is possible to the human being, is not possible to the ape. Even in the human being, observe how many are capable of it. Conscious, accelerated evolution. So I had an example which is very common today among young children. Many children who are struggling with very distracted, poor concentration, and the parents are always struggling. Come on, pay attention, sit straight, concentrate. And the child doesn't want to do it. So the moment you whack him, he will sit. But other than that, he will stubbornly resist. There's so many we see of that type today. If there is not within the soul's awakening that says, I want something more, then you will not have the capacity for the yoga. If you tell the child, you know what, you can actually increase your intelligence, you can increase your power of concentration and develop into such and such thing, and the child says, yeah, so what? But what do I need it for? You do not have possibility of yoga. And for such a child, then the urge to move forward should be strong desire, the Rajasic impulse. So from tamas, you have to pass through the Rajasic impulse in order to come up to some degree of sattvic awareness, where now you begin to feel the need for and the possibility of something higher, and then you can actually make a conscious participatory effort. But this is possible in the human stage. That's why the human stage is so important. Even the ape does not have it. It must be observed that the appearance of human mind and body on the earth marks a crucial step, a decisive change in the course and process of the evolution. Not only the direction of evolution changes, the method of evolution also changes. It is not merely a continuation of the old lines. So what is the change of direction? What is the change of method? We will see later. Of this, Sri Aurobindo also gives great importance to in his last writings, where he speaks of the emergence of the mind of light in the supramental manifestation, series of articles. And there he says that the crucial change in evolution will be the new role played by knowledge in evolution, which was not present before. And in the human stage, this is almost obvious. The fact that we know what is happening in us, the fact that we know these are steps, the fact that we can formulate steps even if we don't know them, and then actively pursue them with a conscious will, it changes the whole method of evolution itself. So what was the old method? What is the new method? And what is the old direction and what is the new direction? And what it implies for the subsequent spiritual and supramental being. That we will take up next Sunday. So looking back at what we read today and putting it in context of our present urge and aspiration, the thing to do as a practice is consciously to assist in this change in the embodiment in our consciousness. Most easily in the mind, and then through the mind on all the other parts. Awaken there the living aspiration, refine, purify as far as possible all the activities and all these levels of consciousness associated with the activities, so that the nature is made most ready. And then bring into all this the potent influence of the psychic flame in the heart and the mind, and even to whatever extent eventually, even if by reflection, in the body itself. And these are things well within our reach, which make possible the accelerated evolution into the spiritual humanity, that what he has described here earlier as the appearance in the human being of a spiritual type resembling mental animal humanity, but already with the stamp of the spiritual aspiration on it. And this is what we must be. And being this, what we must fulfill is obviously that spiritual stamp to be given its greatest prominence. And then we will have the possibility to be among the few especially evolved beings who will form the new type and move towards the new life. I feel uncomfortable formulating it in this way because it tends to acquire as if an elitist viewpoint that we are special somehow and that we have a special opportunity or potential. But on the other hand, Mother herself uses the word elite, an elite of humanity. It takes a form, though, at first, which is elitist. We are already that special humanity. We are already somehow more than others. And in fact, this comment was made in that conference which I spoke of in 1992 at Pondicherry University. When people from Auroville and the ashram spoke of their concept of Sri Aurobindo and his idea of their understanding of Sri Aurobindo and his idea of the next step, there was an undercurrent of this is so much greater than anything else. And somebody in the group that came who were not devotees, but who were professors or thinkers in their own right, actually said, we feel this elitism among all of you who are coming from this space, who are disciples of Sri Aurobindo. And that led to some introspection, and Panditji made this observation. He said that elitism has been the bane of these communities. Because it's as if just because we are following Sri Aurobindo's ideal and this beautiful and highly inspiring vision, we've already become special. Now, of course, there's a truth to that. You are special to be a disciple of Sri Aurobindo and to be able to look upon these ideals and even aspire to them and work for them. But the elitism is undeserved, where you say you've become special in what you are, as in capacity, in consciousness. No, that has not changed. We're not too different from others. We're different only in the opportunity given and the opening to a possibility. What we have done with it will eventually decide whether we are worthy of them. Sri Aurobindo, in response to criticism, where someone said that, with disciples like this, what kind of master will it be? Because disciples are often quite crude. He said, you should not judge the master by the disciples, because necessarily disciples will be of a different type. Rather, you should judge disciples by the master. And so that is the reference point which is placed before us. For a master like this, for an ideal so great, what are we doing? What effort have we made? What progress can we make or have we made, given the time and opportunities that she gave us? And then we find we have not done too well in most cases. There's so much more to be done. And especially when an ideal so high is set, whatever you may do, we will always feel we have fallen short, and that's fine. Because it gives us a reference of what so much more that needs to be done. In Sri Aurobindo's body, in his own consciousness, from the point where he started the intense phase of his yoga, within 5 years he had attained to the experiences of the supramental consciousness, stabilized in the overmental consciousness, and so on. And so it makes us, it places before us a very high standard. Given that he did not have help, given that we have the help, so much more should be possible. And then we have to introspect to see what are the elements which hinder, what are the elements which assist, and then slowly start realigning ourselves. A simple exercise Mother gave to practice every day before sleeping: review the whole day and all its activities and all the responses and thoughts you had. Notice what was aligned to the center of your aspiration. Notice what assisted and nourished the aspiration. Observe also what went contrary to it, or turned you away from it, or neutralized, harmed the aspiration. Just that. Observing it is enough. In time, very quickly, you'll find things will begin to rearrange themselves in your priority. Certain things will become more important, others less. And a kind of an automatic purification, reprioritizing, reordering will happen. And the more this happens, the more all of our thoughts, emotions, actions are centered around and expressive of this aspiration, the more rapid and easy the whole journey will become. So these are some indications for us. Recognizing the truth of the elitism in opportunity given, recognizing also the insufficiency of what we have done, but then using that as a reference to grow further. Always remembering that the help is constantly there. The Mother and Sri Aurobindo, having taken a station at the subtle physical plane, which is the closest point to the physical, as dense as the physical, just invisible to our physical sight though. From there, the help they are giving actively wherever you are in the world, it does not matter. Free of the physical body's limitations, the action is everywhere. But you have to call, you have to ask, you have to open, you have to receive, you have to contain, you have to assimilate, you have to stabilize, you have to transmute, or the transmutation process you have to participate in. And then everything will happen perhaps as rapidly as it can be for the readiness of our nature. We can meditate on this and continue next Sunday.